Last winter something astonishing, something extraordinary happened to me in this forest. This documentary examines the greater questions surrounding what happened. All of the characters in this story are real.
Here we are in the Balingup forest, with conditions ideal for fungus growth. This is the time of the year for mushrooms and toadstools. The trees, the grass, the dampness, everything is right for them to fruit. And amongst these little toadstools on the ground are to be found the little brown mushroom, the most famous of which are the psilocybe mushrooms or magic mushrooms. And this is the reason why at this time you'll see furtive figures in the background searching for these little treasures.
I came to live in Balingup about 10 years ago. As far as I know, there were no mushroom pickers then. They started about 3 or 4 years ago, and the numbers have been building up steadily. Last year was a really bad year for lots of people.
Each vehicle that stopped will be numbering it. There's provision at the rego, the sort of vehicle, observation, time it was stopped. So
I guess I'm grateful for that presence just because of the trespassing issues that are involved. Matter of fact, I even called the police and thanked them this week.
Where will you be, Barry?
I'll be here.
Back here. So you want the vehicles brought back here?
Back here. Around the side. Back here.
And the 3 cars that are up there now, there's a white ute, a little mustard yellow station wagon.
Even the alternatives in this community were banding together to try and sort of stomp it down a little bit. You know. And we were, a few people were actually helping the police, taking number plates.
8A something or other, those 3 there. So whoever goes and sits there now is going to have to be wary of those coming through until we get communications established.
Well, grab the keys to the silver car and you can go down the street and do what you have to do now. Right, and then... yeah, see Peter first.
Having broken the rule, this sort of great divide of being a non-drug user into being a drug user, what then happens is that you sort of throw away a lot of the messages, the health messages, and you actually become more deviant in many ways, because you've learned that you can break this law, the world doesn't crash in around your feet, so therefore you tend to go on and do and break other and transgress other rules as well.
If Mick lets us know,
he'll let us know when they're coming in.
One of us can creep down this road here.
Well, we'll grab the first one.
Yep. As soon as you get back there, he can move in here and take over the second car here.
Yeah, just tell him that there's a little bit of movement going on, mate. Just to stand by.
This isn't happening.
Socks too, mate.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Stay there.
Which one, mate?
Stay there, mate. Stay there. Stay there.
Got a badge?
Well, that's all I want to know. All I want was an honest answer. Right.
That's what the police are doing, is having a good day out and enjoying the fact that they're enforcing the law. this is done in a discriminatory manner, because when you look at the convictions for possession of magic mushrooms, if you're driving a Mercedes, you don't get your dashboard searched, or you don't get your boot searched. If you're driving an old Holden or an old Kingswood, you certainly will. So the police enforce this law in a highly arbitrary fashion, and we know that the sort of person that's likely to be busted for any drug offence is likely to be predominantly male, working class, unemployed, and who are the traditional enemies of the police force.
The active drug found in magic mushrooms is psilocin or psilocybin. These chemicals are very similar in their structure to LSD. They act on the central part of the brain, on the brain stem and the cerebral cortex. In those parts of the brain there are receptors, and these receptors have the drug act on them, and they're stimulated. The normal chemicals which act on the receptors is 5-HT or serotonin, but psilocybin or psilocin can act on these receptors, stimulate them, and produce the hallucinogenic effect.
Pursuant to the Misuse of Drugs Act, it is an offence, a criminal offence, to possess psilocybin or to have anything with psilocybin in it in your possession. If you are convicted of the offence of having a substance with psilocybin in it in your possession, you will be dealt with in a court of petty sessions before a magistrate, and under the provisions of the Misuse of Drugs Act, penalties are provided of a fine of $2,000 or 2 years imprisonment or both.
In fact, I think these laws are a bit silly, because the fact that it's our choice whether we decide to eat these cybins ourselves.
I like to say good day to my father, and it's God's garden and I choose to eat it.
And it was $150. Most expensive mushroom I ever didn't eat.
Let's find one of these magic mushrooms and have a look at it to see what its characteristics are. Now, there's a little group of them growing down here, and we'll pick up a couple of them and notice how very different the young and the old are. This is characteristic of mushrooms and toadstools. You can never really be safe just looking at one. Notice in the young one the peak to the dome of the cap and the white stem, a stem that in age or when you crush it goes blue. You can see the colour change very clearly in this older specimen. Slimy on the cap, no ring, and notice that the spore powder, which occurs on the gills, is a dark purplish black, rather the same as the spore powder on the common mushroom. No cup or any developmental swelling at the base. Those are the characteristics of this particular psilocybe, Psilocybe subaeruginosa.
I think what I like most about magic mushrooms is the excitement of actually trying to find them.
Yeah, especially the way we organised it those couple of times that we went, just parking the car in the next sort of property.
Hiding it.
I heard on the grapevine that they were paying for maps to direct them to this blue mushroom.
Hiding the car, yeah. Just basically waiting till no car's coming, then sort of sprinting across the road, over the fence and into the forest.
In commando style.
Yeah, and of course for the first half an hour you can't see them, your eyes just aren't tuned, are they?
Yeah.
They bring a joy all of their own.
And perhaps even more anciently known is the use of the famous fly agaric that everybody knows, the red mushroom with the white spots on it. The fly agaric is supposed to have been the basis for the Norwegian warriors going berserk after they had become high on eating it. They became even more high if they drank the urine of people who had been eating the fly agaric, because this concentrates and even enhances the effect. The reindeer are supposed to graze on the fly agaric and become wild afterwards. It plays a big part in some of the shamanistic ceremonies of the Northern Hemisphere.
In about 1500 BC, there was a massive migration of Aryan people into the north of India, and they brought with them the cult of Soma, Soma being the magic fly agaric mushroom. And then, out of the cult of Soma arose the religion Hinduism. Right. Now, Hindus don't use magic mushrooms anymore, but their ancient book Rig Veda contains well over 1,000 hymns to Soma. And there's even the theory that Christianity has its roots in a magic mushroom culture, and it's based on fairly metaphorical interpretations of the Old and New Testament, whereby the story of Jesus is in fact a euphemism for the fruiting body of the magic fly agaric mushroom. In other words, Jesus Christ is a mushroom. Well, I reckon it's got to be more than just a coincidence that red mushrooms with white spots have so often been used to illustrate children's books. Now, perhaps the authors and illustrators of children's books have really been drug fiends who have surreptitiously programmed us all from a very young age, and that's why society is so dependent on drugs. And who can forget the unusual effect that eating a mushroom had on Alice? So I reckon the more you think about it, the more you realise that we all have historical, cultural and religious links with magic mushrooms.
The reasons why I take mushrooms are sort of fairly well related to the way I live. It's for the same reason people probably drink or smoke drugs or anything. It's just some form of escape. Not that I would take mushrooms every day after I'd had a hard day's work. Not that I do.
We're looking for wildflowers, and we thought, oh gee whiz, look, it just turns green and all these people come out, and look, they're all young people, isn't that nice? And it took us a while to realise that they were looking for mushrooms.
Well, one day we had a boy in here to buy something, and he was just turned 16, and he said he'd come off a fishing boat, and he said he would go and find mushrooms out Jay's Road, and that he would boil them. And blue fluid he would drink afterwards, and he would see psychedelic colours.
Oh God. We jumped the road, jumped the fence again with all the goodies in hand, and got back in the car, sort of took off, and one of us sat in the back, cross-legged, in this sort of sedan type, no, it was a wagon actually, sorry, and had this little primer stove and started bubbling away, got some water and started boiling up these mushies as we were driving back on the road.
The fresher the better.
Yeah, the fresher the better. So we put in what we considered to be a good serving, which is about 15 for 3 of us.
Yeah.
And within 10 minutes, the guy in the back was serving us some mushroom tea, and about 15 minutes later, as we were still driving, we started to it was like, I don't know, we were on a shuttle, or we were just cruising up and down these roads. I actually thought that we were driving through the belly of a snake.
Our main concern in relation to the mushrooms is the consumption of them. It is a hurdle. We've had incidences where people have had vehicle accidents.
Driving was really good because you didn't have to concentrate on anything. It was like the road was good enough. It was like TV.
Yeah.
All you had to do was just watch and look at things. And every time a sign came up, like a sign saying "give way," we'd stop the car and look and go, "Give way, give way," and we'd spent ages working out what "give way" meant.
We've also heard of people being admitted to hospital, suffering all sorts of health problems, and also mental problems. There's all types of people do go down there, and it's just an influx of people to the area, some undesirable, and that's obviously of concern to the police.
By their cars, a lot of them are quite well to do. There are a lot of Volvos and Porsches and Commodores, and so they're not all young hippie type people. There are a lot of people with young children because in the rubbish there are disposable nappies.
Magic mushrooms users tend to be younger, they tend to be a bit more curious, they tend to be a bit more alternative in terms of having, I want to explore myself. And for many people, the use of drugs, rather than being a sort of a deviant and depressing experience, it's actually a way of exploring and understanding themselves. I mean, you can understand yourself by travelling around the globe, but you can also understand yourself by travelling internally.
One possibility is that they come down and eat mushrooms down here because they can't afford to buy Southwest wine anymore. $16 to $20 a bottle. You're not going to get very many unemployed people being able to afford enough wine to get high. But you certainly can come down and pick some mushrooms for free and boil them up in a bit of river water and have yourself a nice drink for the cost of a tank of petrol.
So are you suggesting that it's only unemployed people who come down here? I think that's leaping to a wild conclusion, isn't it?
Well, I based that on my observation of cars, that people that drive old beat-up cars are more likely to be unemployed than those that spend $40,000 on
Look what I drive.
I rest my case.
Mitsubishi Ute.
For some people, and one obviously has to look at the sort of the hippies of these, that was very much a culture which used LSD and hallucinogens with great enthusiasm.
And if kids today want to go out and get on drugs, I reckon they should be allowed to.
I think we've all learned that, these drugs can be overused and that use can be damaging. But a lot of people still find that as part of their growing up, as part of their sort of exploration as a 17 to 25-year-old, use and sort of the broadening of experience that hallucinogens gives can actually enhance their understanding of themselves.
The great danger of attempting to collect the hallucinogenic mushrooms is the presence of little brown mushrooms that are actually deadly, the most famous of all being the Gallerina. And here is one of those that I've just collected. This is Gallerina autumnalis, one of the deadliest of the small brown mushrooms, and one dangerously similar to the psilocybin. Notice the similarity of the colour of the cap. However, on turning it the other way up, you can see that the stem is uniformly brown, whereas it's a dirty white in the psilocybe. And the spore powder is a rust colour in the Gallerina, whereas it's the purple-brown colour in the psilocybe. This actually contains the same poisons as occur in the deadly death cap of the Northern Hemisphere that is responsible for 95% of all deaths from fungus poisoning. The symptoms of this poison are that one perhaps feels a bit queasy, something that one might dismiss after eating a few mushrooms, and then the symptoms disappear, only to reappear 2 or 3 days later in the most agonizing form while there's destruction of the liver and kidney. They are, in fact, extremely dangerous.
It's extremely difficult to identify magic mushrooms, and because they're illegal, there's no information available to help you get it right. And even if you find a reference for a picture of one in a book in a library, I often find when you turn to the right page, the picture's been ripped out. So people choose their mushrooms by trial and error based on word-of-mouth descriptions, which can end in disaster considering there are deadly poisonous mushrooms out there.
The deceiver. Stropharia. Gymnopolis pampianus. Foliota. Swillus granulatus. Pycnoporus coccineus. Gallerina. Mycena pura. Here's evidence that people have been picking in the forest behind us, concluded that they haven't got the psilocybe, because these are in fact foliotas, and then dumped the lot.
Some people say that they should be illegal because they're dangerous. I'm not sure how dangerous they are. The only times I've had them, which are a few times, I've just been well, there's been no harm done to myself or to anyone else, because it's pretty hard to do much when you're basically just laughing the whole time.
I didn't feel any sort of like yearning for them afterwards. It was like a good experience that sure I'd have it again, but wouldn't want to do it straight away.
The use of any psychoactive drug has risks. There's no such thing as absolutely safe psychoactive drugs. In terms of its dependency potential, the interesting thing about hallucinogenic drugs is that you seldom see someone having withdrawal symptoms from hallucinogens. And the reason for this is that most people quickly learn how to get the maximum effect from their hallucinogens, and they do that by titrating the dose down, not up. So you don't get escalation of dose, which is essential, really, I think, for some sort of unmarked dependence or withdrawal syndrome. So what you get people knowing that the best way to have a good trip is to use it in moderate doses. So in fact, with hallucinogens, less is more.
I remember being sick afterwards, but that was all gone in 15 minutes or so. No, they're not dangerous.
I think you might lose it for a while, but I don't think you'd actually die. unless you were mentally unstable, of course, to start with, and then once again you could be in some trouble. But that's more a symptom of you than the drug, I think.
All of us are on some dimension from being absolutely sane to crazy. And the interesting thing about hallucinogenic drugs is that for some people, and I suspect they're down this end of the dimension, the use of hallucinogenic drugs can trigger a toxic psychosis, or even a psychosis in its own right, and that is madness. The best example of this is that in certain parts of Glasgow, which in fact as you go to the outskirts of Glasgow in the autumn, you get a superb crop of magic mushrooms just growing up from Loch Lomond. And as somebody who worked in the local psychiatric hospital there was always, every year, as everyone flocked out to sort of score the magic mushrooms, there were always a few casualties from this in terms of very florid psychiatric symptoms akin to schizophrenia. Now, do these drugs make people schizophrenic? No. What I think happens is that people who are beginning to find their thinking becoming a little disordered, who are getting a bit cosmic in their overall construing style, find these drugs very attractive and rush in and take too much. And in fact, what you can have with any drug like this is this sort of psychological crisis. Interestingly enough, what you can do, you can manage these things relatively effectively. So what you need to do is to have a period of medication where people are tranquilised and calmed and reassured, and many people will recover from those experiences without any permanent damage.
My vision started to really sort of start going astray. Everything in the room and all the people that were there started to sort of not quite float, but sort of drip and melt, all sort of Salvador Dali, like, you know, dripping clocks.
Physiologically, I sort of like lost the feelings in my body, and like my hands no longer could I couldn't feel anything that I was holding. I remember walking around the house and the floor was moving. It's like a bit like a magic carpet ride, really. It was just like roaming up and down the little turrets in the carpet, and the carpet was coming at you and you were just like rocking with it.
My hearing also started to almost fracture. Separate sounds were split up, and so that what you were hearing, what people were saying, you didn't hear until quite a while after it actually been said. And even when I spoke myself, it was hard to realise that I was actually speaking until a little bit later on.
Walked into a few rooms and remember looking in a mirror and thinking, whoa!
And all around me, in a total 360 degrees, were little creatures. Like just little creatures with little skeletons, just going like talking and moving and gyrating. And
yeah, we'll always hallucinate skulls or
Actually, this same trip, I had this creature in front of my eyes, and every time I closed my eyes, this creature would be there going, and it was there for about 4 hours.
I guess wanting to experiment with any drugs is escapism, isn't it? I mean, if you're not happy with your lot, or you want to add an extra dimension to your life, then you try something different, and it depends on how much of a risk taker you are in that respect.
But it's also a social thing. I mean, you know, if you go to a party, I mean, people are not smoking marijuana to get high. It's somehow like the old Indian passing the peace pipe. It's a sort of solidarity and camaraderie of getting slightly mellowed out while doing something that's illegal. And, you know, we're all in this together, folks.
Magic mushrooms are common on the east coast of Australia, but they've never been seen here in Western Australia until all of a sudden they start growing in this one tiny little patch no bigger than a football field. which is pretty bizarre.
There are a lot of theories as to how the mushrooms have arrived in the area. One theory that has been bandied around that actually Calm introduced the mushrooms in the pine forest area in order that this particular type of mushroom was to help break down the pine cones.
Now, I've got no idea personally how the mushrooms first started in the area. It has been rumoured that an old hippie from many years gone by brought some back from overseas and planted them, and they've just taken off from there.
Now, one theory is that magic mushrooms actually arrive randomly on Earth and that they travel as spores on cosmic dust through space, and that the hallucinations they provide are actually the messages of aliens from other worlds.
I think we can dismiss the theory that they're actually of extraterrestrial origin. So how do they make their way to this corner of the woodland in Balingup? Another idea is that they might have blown across the Nullarbor Plain from South Australia, where it's known that they grow, by means of spores, but it's a very long way for spores to come to this one spot. The other suggestion is that people actually brought them here deliberately to start some sort of industry in hallucinogenic mushrooms. But one would have thought that they might have chosen the gold tops, a better known and more easily grown a magic mushroom than this particular species. Then there is the suggestion that they were actually introduced by Conservation and Land Management. It's known that they've been working on fungi in association with pine trees, the so-called mycorrhizal association, but it seems very unlikely that they would introduce such a thing without proper notification, being an official body, and anyway, these particular species are not mycorrhizal, so I think we can dismiss this theory. It's this dung growing here, this cow dung, that perhaps gives us the clue, because cattle have been grazing in this woodland for a number of years, and the spores of fungi such as this can actually live in the gut of cattle and be excreted and grow in the dung and then spread from that particular point. This would seem to be the best theory of how these particular mushrooms arrived in this particular place.
But if you think about it, cattle have been transported all over Western Australia for decades, so why would they only suddenly appear now in this one little patch? Now, I spoke to a mushroom picker that travels all around Australia from mushroom patch to mushroom patch to mushroom patch, and I think it's possible that someone like that could have introduced the mushrooms into the area. However, I admit that we probably will never know exactly how the mushrooms came to Balingup.
A young 8 or 9-year-old schoolboy who is a Balingup resident was offered a bag of mushrooms for sale by some young people that were obviously down here picking mushrooms, and that really upset a lot of people.
One night I was home on my own and I could see lights down over the brook, and it took me a while to realise that that's probably what it was, mushroom hunters. But it's just, I guess in a small town like Balingup, in the country, you assume that you've got a level of security that you don't have in the city, and it's just, I guess, threatens you a little bit to think that that's at risk.
It appears that they left the scene and also left the fire going at the same time, and it appears that this fire had spread to the bridge itself, and the bridge appeared to be on fire. My wife actually came past coming home from work one evening and noticed that the bridge was actually on fire. She informed me of the situation, and I in turn informed my fire control officer, who rendezvoused with me on site at the bridge, and we subsequently put the fire out.
The contacts I've had with them, they've been very nice people. There were 2 young boys there with guitars under the bridge, sheltering from the rain, and I had a really nice talk to them. I thought they were great. They do leave a lot of rubbish around, and that's my big gripe.
Well, I worked for 10 years in a government office, and I've worked for 25 years in this business, and I believe that I've put a great deal of time and effort into my children, and I believe that I shouldn't be repaid in this way by children taking this kind of drug.
I said, did you eat any of them? You replied, yeah. I said, how many? About half a dozen. What about your mates? Did they eat any? You replied, I don't know. I said, what did you intend to do with the ones you picked? And you replied, eat them.
Gold 643, Bunbury Base. Reach down, base, receiving.
The media publicity that was generated from these operations obviously assisted us greatly in bringing to the attention of the people that the problem with the mushrooms, and also the fact that police would be there and would do something about the matter.
The interesting thing about publicity about drug use is that in many ways it's done in a rather naive view, that if you warn people about drugs they won't do them. But in fact we know about media that at the end of the day it's not really what the media does to people, it's what people do with the media they hear. And for many people who don't do drugs, some shock horror about drugs or police arresting people will scare them away from doing what they wouldn't have done anyway. But for people who have an interest, that is in fact it's like the oxygen of publicity, which encourages interest, spark interest, and actually will make them go off and experiment, because they'll actually be informed that yes, there are drugs available and yes, they are interesting things to do.
And I had this really full-on sort of butterfly feeling in my stomach, and it sort of almost moved through my body and became a real full-on cosmic sexual experience. And I hadn't had sex for half a year. That probably contributed to it and helped, definitely, I'd say. And I mean, it went on for like an hour or two, and it was just like making love to colours, making love to smells, sounds, and being at one with them almost. It was really, really spun out. And there was a person which was interested at the time who was actually there. Or it felt like she was there, but she wasn't really there. And I'd love to actually speak to her and see what she felt. So it was a really full-on experience. I didn't actually ejaculate, so I didn't have a wank or anything. It was just a real full-on sexual wave that sort of went through, sort of on and off sort of thing. I'd love to try them again. It was almost like better. It's better than real sex, almost. It's just intense. I'd love to actually make love on them. It'd be a spun-out experience, I think.
It'd sort of swell up and then disappear again. You'd feel quite normal again. And then the next time, you'd breathe up again, a little stronger than the last time, and disappear again. Each time getting stronger and stronger, until our roof turned into the ocean, which was a little hard to deal with, especially because it was upside down.
I was in the process of becoming part mushroom, or so I thought, in that I was very sedate, not moving a lot, and thinking about things which I suppose if a mushroom could think, it would think was important, the natural things in life. I suppose humans in general tend to skate across the surface of the earth in vehicles such as cars like this one, whereas my thoughts when I thought I was part mushroom were so totally removed from most things humans think about. All I could think about was how grass was, or how trees were, and how they're sort of built, how they get life out of the earth, whereas we seem to just skate across the surface, ravaging things in the way. But I wasn't thinking about that in any political way. It was just on a very simple level, which I suppose was because I was fairly hammered.
One of the questions I think we should ask ourselves is why people need to take drugs, why they need to, their lives are so unfulfilled that they're really into all this sort of stuff. I don't really think that making it a criminal offence is the answer. I think it's more that we need to make people more fulfilled in their life. And I don't really think that magic mushrooms are any different from any other drug like alcohol or tobacco or coffee or tea probably, or even food and the things that we get addicted on.
Well, I think the way the authorities are dealing with the magic mushroom problem is very traditional in a sense, in that, you know, they make the drug illegal, then they arrest those who use it. Now, Balingup's a tiny town, it's isolated, it's never had a drug problem before, it's virginal in a sense to the whole world of drugs. So I think you can look at this situation as a kind of test model or a microcosm of the greater drug problems of the world, particularly as to whether making drugs illegal is the answer.
Prohibition on any drug, including magic mushrooms, has interesting and often unforeseen consequences. The first is that it actually diffuses the drug through the community because everyone sells on to everybody else. It actually causes pyramid selling. It's a bit like Amway International gone berserk. And everybody knows where to get them from, they all score off their friends, they all sell on to one another. So in fact, your child or whatever won't be sold drugs at the schoolyard gate by some deviant pusher in a dirty coat, but in fact by their best friend.
Well, there's always the situation could arise where someone could go pick the wrong mushrooms, go off to a party, supply them around the place, and we could have numerous people being ill, think they're taking magic mushrooms when in fact they're taking something completely different.
The most interesting thing about prohibition, that at the end of the day it has nothing to do with harm or the dangerousness of drugs. Prohibition, in fact, is really a conspiracy of first world countries against third world countries. What you have the drugs of the first world, alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceutical products as legal things, where the drugs of the third world, coca, opium and cannabis, are illegal. Now the interesting thing about magic mushrooms is that originally they were a third world product. And so what you have here is something which the majority of first world people don't use. And so the idea that the police are actually saving us from ourselves by the law, enforcing the law, I think is absolutely wrong.
If there's to be prosecution simply because people might damage themselves by collecting little brown mushrooms, then one perhaps should extend it to prosecute people for collecting any mushrooms, because they might harm themselves by collecting poisonous mushrooms in mistake for those that are good to eat.
By having prohibition, you actually make drugs more dangerous, and you can show that by adulterants. But in this case, in magic mushrooms, you can actually argue that people just don't get the right sort of information. I mean, if they were really concerned about people not damaging themselves with magic mushrooms, what you wouldn't do is give them a criminal conviction. What you wouldn't do is have no information available to users about how to use well and wisely. And the interesting thing, that all drugs, no matter how bad or dangerous their reputation, can actually be used well and wisely if people know what to do. So in fact, prohibition and law enforcement actually stops people using drugs in the least damaging way possible. And quite clearly there are rules and recipes for using any hallucinogen. One is that you do it when you're feeling in a good space, when you're in a good place, and when you're with good people. Because one of the problems with hallucinogens is there is always the risk that they're going to trigger psychological disaster. And it's not just the drug itself, it's also the mood of the taker. And if you're feeling a bit anxious, if you think the priests are breathing down your neck, if you're not with people you're typically, you're terribly happy with, then that's more likely to make that trip a bad one. But if you're comfortable, if you're feeling serene, if you're feeling with good people, and usually it's quite useful to have somebody who's straight, who's not using alongside you to talk you down if things get a bit ratty around the edges.
But however the magic mushrooms got here, there's no doubt that they're here to stay. Their spores are going to be distributed all over the southwest, and they will become more and more common.
There are old mushroom pickers, there are bold mushroom pickers, but there are no old bold mushroom pickers. Anon.